It wasn't just a coffin. It was something that didn't want to stay buried, and I swear I saw it.
Have you ever been in a place so silent that you suddenly realized the silence itself had a sound? It sounds strange, I know, but that night the silence didn't just have a sound, it had a voice, and that voice knew my name. I'm not talking about a hallucination caused by fatigue nor a trick of my mind. I'm talking about something real, palpable, something that crept into my ear like a cold whisper, and that ever since, I've never been able to forget. It was a November dawn, the kind of night when the cold doesn't just bite your skin, but seems to seep into your bones. The wind blowing through the cemetery carried a damp scent of rotting leaves, mixed with the almost metallic aroma of rust coating the main gate. I'd worked there for years, but something was different that night. I couldn't tell if it was the full moon hanging in the sky like a curious eye, or the way the shadows seemed thicker than usual, but there was a tension in the air, as if the place itself were holding its breath. That cemetery was in a forgotten part of Salem, Massachusetts, a town already marked by stories of witchcraft, trials, and deaths that time could never fully bury. The cemetery itself was almost a relic, with graves dating back to the 18th and 19th centuries and few visitors throughout the year. Most of the graves were covered in moss, tilted or partially swallowed by the earth. But there was one in particular that always caught my attention, a simple mausoleum of grey stone, without overly ornate ornaments, but with an uneasy presence. I'd never seen anyone visit that tomb. According to the old record I found in the archives, the last time anyone had been buried there was over 50 years ago, and yet, even in its abandonment, it seemed watchful. That night, as I walked with my flashlight illuminating the gravel path, I noticed something amiss. The heavy stone lid was slightly shifted, as if someone, or something, had tried to pry it open. My first instinct was to think, some vandal had broken into the cemetery. It wouldn't be the first time, but there was one detail that froze me. There were no footprints around, just the untouched, damp earth, smooth as if no one had walked there in days. I approached slowly, and that's when I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind rustling through the twisted trees. But no, there was rhythm, cadence, syllables. I tilted my head, trying to make sense of it, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. The sound seemed to be coming from inside the tomb, a muffled murmur, almost as if someone were reciting an ancient prayer or chanting a chant that made no sense. A shiver ran down my spine. I stood still, listening, until the murmur faded into silence, only to be replaced by something that made me instinctively recoil, a clear, close voice whispering my name. I froze. I looked around, expecting to see someone, but the cemetery was empty. The moonlight illuminated everything around me, and there was no movement, other than the leaves dancing in the wind. I took 2 steps back, my heart pounding so loudly it seemed to echo through the place. And then, as if to prove to me that I wasn't imagining it, the voice repeated, my name, drawn out, prolonged, loaded with an intention that I could not decipher. It was at that moment that I realized I had crossed an invisible line. Until that night, the cemetery had been just my workplace. But after that whisper, it became something more. Something that watched me as much as I watched the place. And for some reason I knew that wouldn't be the last time I heard that voice. And I was right, because what happened in the following days was much worse. Subscribe to the channel and like to follow every detail of this story until the end. You won't want to miss what comes next. I'd always believed that working in a cemetery required more patience than courage. Death didn't scare me, at least not the way it scared most people. It was a job like any other. dirty, tiring but stable. I'd been there for over 15 years, and I knew every curve in the alleys, every rusty gate, every tree that twisted toward the sky, as if trying to escape something that held it to the earth. But as familiar as the place was to me, there was one thing I learned over time. Every cemetery holds its secrets, and this one, in particular, seemed to have more than its share. Salem Cemetery was tucked away from the city center, far from the tourists who came seeking tales of witches and trials. It wasn't the kind of place you'd see in brochures or postcards. It was hidden behind a tall, twisted, wrought iron gate, its black paint peeling in patches, revealing rust-red metal. When the wind blew, the gates creaked in a way that made you believe you were hearing a low moan, like someone wanting you to leave. The floor was an uneven mosaic of stone and packed earth, with patches covered in gravel that never seemed sufficient to muffle the muffled sound of footsteps. Night. This sound echoed in a peculiar way, as if the stones were hollow and whatever lay beneath them was much deeper than expected. The air carried the distinctive scent of a place where time wasn't measured in days or months, but in decades of decay. It wasn't the kind of odor that bothered after years of work. In fact, it became part of the routine, as if it permeated the skin, the clothes, and even the thoughts. The oldest section of the cemetery was to the left as you entered. It held the most imposing tombs, erected for families with enough power and wealth to ensure that death wouldn't make them ordinary. Many of these mausoleums were adorned with statues of angels, but their wings were broken, their cheeks worn away by rain and wind. Some of these sculptures seemed to have different expressions depending on the angle from which they were viewed. And no matter how hard I tried not to think about it, there were nights when I swore they were staring back at me. It was in this wing that I found the tomb that would change everything. A low mausoleum made of grey stone, with no visible inscriptions other than the surname engraved in deep letters. Harrington. I did some research later, and discovered that the Harrington family was one of the most influential in the New England maritime trade in the 19th century. Rich, powerful, and shrouded in rumors of mysterious disappearances and unorthodox rituals. The last recorded burial there was in 1968, a man named Richard Harrington, who, according to an old newspaper clipping, died alone and was found under disturbing circumstances, though the article didn't go into detail. For years, that tomb drew no attention beyond its solitary appearance. I passed it every week, checking for any sign of trespassing, but nothing happened, until that November night I saw the lid dislodged, and that didn't make sense. In my work, I've encountered tombs violated by thieves searching for valuables, or by vandals trying to shock the city, but there were always clear signs: footprints, tool marks, disturbed earth. In this case, there was nothing. It was as if the stone had moved on its own. The most disturbing thing was that, in the following days, the air around the mausoleum felt different, denser, almost electric, as if the space around it was charged with some energy I couldn't explain. I avoided passing by when it wasn't necessary, but at the same time, I felt something pulling me there, a nagging curiosity, like the urge to scratch a wound just to feel the pain. I remember one cold morning, just before sunrise, when I discovered a new detail, a small mark at the base of the stone door, as if something had scratched inside. It wasn't large, but it was fresh, and when I ran my fingers over it, the stone still felt strangely warm. I kept it to myself. No one at work would understand, and I didn't want to be the butt of the other gravediggers' jokes. But with each passing day, I realized the tomb was no longer just a forgotten stone structure. It was as if it were alive, and if it was alive, perhaps it was trying to communicate. It was during this period that I began to notice something else. Whenever the wind came from the north, it brought with it a low, muffled sound, almost like a distant moan. I told myself it was the rustling of trees or some animal, but on certain nights the sound seemed so close that I swore I felt the warmth of breath on my neck. And that's when everything starts to get out of hand. Because the first time I saw the tomb actually open, I realized there was nothing I could do to ignore what was happening. The first time I found the tomb truly open was one morning under a full moon, the kind where the silvery light seems to make everything clearer, yet at the same time, more unreal. I had finished a tour of the eastern side of the cemetery and was returning along the path that passed in front of the Harrington Mausoleum. From a distance, I noticed something different. The stone lid was no longer just displaced as before. It was wide open enough for a person to pass through. My feet slowed, as if my body were trying to resist what my eyes were seeing. The flashlight trembled in my hand, and with each step the silence grew denser, almost solid, as if the air had decided to weigh me down. Drawing closer, I noticed there were no signs of forced entry or recent marks on the ground. The earth, once again, was untouched. No animal tracks, no human footprints, just that emptiness staring back at me from within the open tomb. Then I heard it again. At first it was the same muffled murmur from the first night, like a low, distant chant, its syllables drawn out and meaningless. I leaned in to better capture the sound and realized it was coming from deep within the mausoleum, echoing as if the stone walls amplified every vibration. My instincts told me to retreat, but there was something hypnotic about the sound, as if each unfamiliar word had the power to pull me closer. Before I knew it, I was less than a meter from the entrance. The flashlight's beam partially illuminated the interior, revealing the coffin lid covered in a thin layer of dust and cobwebs. Everything seemed intact, but the whispers didn't stop. On the contrary, they grew more distinct, as if adjusting to my listening. That's when it happened. Amidst the constant murmur, I clearly heard my name, spoken slowly, syllable by syllable, with a softness that didn't seem human. It wasn't an impersonal call, it was intimate, as if whoever was inside knew exactly who I was and how long I'd been there. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and without realizing it, I took a step back, keeping the flashlight fixed on the coffin. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it in the silence of the room. I looked around, expecting to see some intruder, perhaps another employee playing a prank. But there was nothing, only the light wind rustling through the twisted trees and the gate in the distance creaking with a distant high-pitched sound. I decided I needed to close the mausoleum. With a concentrated effort, I pushed the heavy stone lid back into place. The sound of friction reverberated through the cemetery like muffled thunder, and the instant I sealed it, the murmuring ceased completely. I stood still for a few seconds, just listening to my own breathing, trying to process what had just happened. On the way back to the warehouse, my mind searched for a logical explanation. Maybe it was the wind blowing through cracks in the stone. Maybe it was some animal trapped inside. Maybe I was just too tired and my imagination was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. There was something about the way that voice said my name that made me feel watched, as if I'd been chosen to hear it. For the rest of the night, I couldn't stop thinking about the scene. Even the strong coffee I drank to ward off sleep seemed unable to dispel the feeling that that voice was still with me somehow, echoing in the back of my mind. When I finally finished my shift and went home, the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. As I lay in bed, my eyelids already heavy, I swore I heard far away, as if coming from the bedroom walls, the same muffled murmur. The next morning, upon returning to work, I walked straight to the mausoleum. To my surprise, or perhaps to my confirmation, the lid was again slightly dislodged. Not as much as the night before, but enough to show me that what had happened was no accident. It was as if something deep inside kept trying to force its way in, little by little. It was at that moment that I realized that no matter how many times I closed that tomb, it would find a way to open again. And worse, each time it did, the whispers grew clearer. I didn't know it yet, but that would be just the first of many nights when the silence of the cemetery would be broken by a voice that shouldn't exist, and each time it would be closer. In the days that followed, something changed in my relationship with that cemetery. Before, it had been a silent, predictable place, where every sound had a logical explanation and every shadow was in its right place. Now, every step I took seemed accompanied by a silent anticipation, as if the place itself were waiting for me to approach the Harrington Mausoleum again. And, against all better judgment, I did. I tried to convince myself it was just part of the job, that I needed to make sure nothing had been tampered with by vandals. But deep down, there was a curiosity that bordered on obsession. Every morning, my first stop was the tomb, and I would invariably find the lid dislodged, never in the same way, as if it had been opened by different hands each time. Some nights, as I closed the cemetery gate, I would glance in its direction and feel as if something was watching me back, hidden in that thick darkness that the moonlight couldn't penetrate. It was then that the whispers began to follow me out of work. The first time I was washing dishes at home with the television on in the living room. The sound was low, distant but familiar. The same muffled murmur, like a drawn-out chant. I thought it was some noise coming from the street until the voice broke through the indistinct noise and spoke my name in the same soft, drawn-out voice I'd heard in the cemetery. I dropped the plate in the sink. The water kept running, but I couldn't move. I looked around searching for some explanation, but the house was empty. I closed all the doors and windows, trying to dispel the thought that this was possible. I slept poorly that night, and when I finally did, I dreamed of the mausoleum. But in the dream, the lid was already wide open, and inside there was no coffin, just a dark hole that seemed endless. I woke up sweating, breathing rapidly, and with the metallic taste of blood in my mouth, as if I'd bitten my tongue in my sleep. The next day, I returned to the cemetery, and as expected, found the grave moved once again. But this time, there was something else. Small scratch marks on the stone, like the ones I'd seen before, only more numerous. I ran my hand over them and felt them deep, as if made with sharp nails or some thin tool. The stone was cold this time, almost frozen. From that moment on, I began to avoid wandering through the more remote areas alone. With every moving shadow, every sudden sound, my body reacted as if it were about to be touched by something invisible. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would wake with the sensation that someone was sitting on the edge of my bed. I couldn't see anything when I opened my eyes, but the sensation lingered, along with a faint smell of damp earth in the room. One day I decided to install security cameras in the cemetery, positioning one discreetly to directly monitor the mausoleum. I wanted proof, something that could show an intruder, an animal, anything physical that could explain what was happening. I waited 3 nights before reviewing the recordings. When I finally sat down at the computer and pressed play, my heart raced. The first night, nothing. The second, also nothing, but on the third something happened. At 3:27 a.m., the stone lid began to move on its own, millimeter by millimeter, until it was ajar. There was no one in sight. And then, for a few seconds, a shadow darker than the night itself seemed to emerge from within, formless, just a presence that caused the camera to freeze. When the image returned to normal, the lid was exactly as it had been. Watching that recording left me feeling a deep chill, not just in my body, but in my mind. because I knew that at that moment, whatever that thing was, it was already aware of me watching it. After that, the dreams got worse. I saw the mausoleum, heard the sound of the lid dragging, and felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. Every time I tried to turn to see what it was, I woke up. But what disturbed me most was that just before I opened my eyes, I heard that voice calling me again, clearer, closer. I began to lose track of time. Work, which had previously followed a methodical routine, became nothing more than a break between sleepless nights and mornings spent watching the grave. My colleagues began to notice that I was pale, with dark circles under my eyes. When they asked if I was okay, I just smiled and said yes, even though I knew my sanity was beginning to fracture. By then, I already understood that I wasn't dealing with something that could be explained in simple words. It was as if the mausoleum were alive, and worse, as if it were choosing me for something I didn't yet understand. And part of me wanted to understand. What I didn't know was that, on the next full moon, this curiosity would lead me into that place, and from then on, there would be no turning back. The full moon that night seemed larger than usual, so bright. It transformed the cemetery into a sea of silvery light and long shadows. I knew I needed to return to the mausoleum, but this time not to observe it from a distance. I was going inside. Part of me screamed to forget everything, to let the mystery remain sealed under stone and silence. But another part, the one already tainted by the call, wanted answers no matter the cost. I took with me a flashlight, an iron bar, and a coil of heavy chain. The intention was simple: open, check, close, and seal. By the time I reached the cemetery gate, the wind had already changed. It was no longer the cold, constant wind of the past few weeks. It came in short bursts, almost like hurried breaths, as if the air itself was in a hurry to push me inside. Arriving in front of the mausoleum, I felt a chill so intense my hands went numb. The lid was wider open than I'd ever seen it, as if it had been waiting for me. Moonlight illuminated part of the interior, but the rest remained shrouded in darkness that not even the flashlight seemed willing to penetrate. I took a deep breath, gripped the iron bar between my hands, and took the first step inside. The smell hit me first. It wasn't just the familiar scent of damp stone and accumulated dust. There was something else, a sweet, cloying aroma like rotting flowers mixed with rusted iron. The light revealed the coffin in the center, intact but now covered in fresh marks, deep, parallel scratches, as if desperate nails had tried to rip through the metal. I moved closer, and it was at that moment that the murmur returned. This time it wasn't distant or muffled. It was clear, so close it seemed to come from inside my head. The voice said my name slowly, with an almost loving intonation. But each syllable carried a weight that made my muscles tense. I tried to respond, a "who's there?" but my voice came out weak, swallowed by the cold echo of the walls. Then I felt it, a draft, coming from inside the coffin, touched my face like a cold breath. The lid didn't move, but the sound changed. It wasn't whispers anymore. It was rapid, unintelligible words like a prayer or a spell spoken urgently. My instincts told me to back away, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The flashlight's light began to fail, flickering irregularly. In the last flash before it went out, I saw something move on the inside surface of the coffin lid. A pale, thin hand with broken nails, pressing against the metal inside. A sharp sound, like metal being scraped, echoed through the mausoleum. I took 2 steps back, my heart racing, but before I could react, the voice stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. The air was so thick it felt hard to breathe. Then a sharp crack shattered the stillness, and the coffin lid gave way a few inches, as if being pushed from the inside out. The iron bar fell from my hand, hitting the ground with a sound that echoed like a scream. Without thinking, I ran to the entrance, but stopped when I sensed I wasn't alone. Something was standing behind me, so close I could feel the heat, or lack thereof, against my back. I didn't dare turn around. That's when I heard the voice, no longer a whisper, but as if it were speaking directly into my ear. "You opened it. Now, there's no way to close it." Panic made me react. I ran outside, pulled the lid with all my strength and fitted the chain around the structure, tightening the padlock with trembling hands. As I did so, the wind blew hard, and I swear I heard an insistent scratching on the other side of the stone, growing faster and faster, accompanied by low laughter, as if something inside was amused by my futile attempt to seal it. When I finally finished, I took a few steps back, trying to catch my breath. The cemetery had been completely silent, but that silence now held weight, as if the place itself were watching, waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the cold stone, trying to convince myself I was safe. But deep down, I knew, no matter how tightly I tightened those chains, no matter how many padlocks I used, whatever was inside had already found a way to reach me. And for the first time, I felt that maybe it wasn't me watching the tomb. Maybe it was the other way around, and that feeling would only become more real when I got home that night. I arrived home much later than I'd imagined. The street was deserted, and the silence there seemed as oppressive as the cemeteries. I felt exhausted, as if I'd spent hours carrying an invisible weight on my shoulders. I locked the door, turned on all the lights, and left the television on, more to create the illusion of company than out of interest in what was playing on the screen. But the feeling of being alone didn't come. On the contrary, it was as if something had walked through the gates with me. I sat in the kitchen, trying to gather my thoughts, when I noticed an envelope on the table. I didn't remember leaving it there. The paper was yellowed, with frayed edges, and on the front, written in elegant dark letters, was my last name, Harrington. My heart raced. My hands trembled as I slid my finger under the flap and removed the contents. Inside was only an old, sepia-toned photograph of a child with an intense gaze standing before a grave, the same grave I had just tried to seal. As I stared at the child's face, a chill ran down my spine. On the back of the photo, handwritten, was a single sentence. "You heard. Now you need to respond." At that moment, the television turned off by itself. All the lights flickered and went out. I was left in complete darkness until, coming from the hallway, I heard that same muffled murmur that had accompanied me since the first night. I called out for someone, simply hoping there would be a logical explanation, but the voice didn't respond. Instead, it began repeating my name, growing softer and softer, as if it were getting closer, step by step. My body froze. I looked at the kitchen door and saw the shadow forming there, denser than the darkness around it. And it was at that moment that I realized it wasn't just the Harrington tomb that was reopening itself. There were others, and some had been open for a long time. The murmuring ceased, but the silence that replaced it was even more dangerous, because now I knew it wouldn't end there. And if you think this story was disturbing, wait until you hear what happened to the next grave I found. One that should never have been touched, but which somehow was already waiting for me before I even arrived. Have you ever heard of a grave that just won't stay closed? It may sound like an urban legend, a story made up to scare visitors, but I assure you, there are graves that seem to have a will of their own. I've seen it myself, and in the case I'm about to tell you about, it wasn't just once. It was several nights, several signs, always in the same place, a small forgotten corner of the cemetery, reserved only for children. This part of the land is different from all the others. The headstones are small, low, some worn to the point where the names are barely legible. Among them, old toys are scattered as if they had been left yesterday. porcelain dolls with broken faces, rusty cars, teddy bears soiled by age. The wind, when it blows through, carries a high-pitched, distant sound, as if reminding us that this is a place that should never be disturbed. It was in this section that I found a peculiar grave. It stood out from the rest, not because it had a larger or more ornate headstone, but because of one detail that was impossible to ignore. There were always fresh flowers on the ground. Always. It didn't matter if it was a harsh winter or a hot summer. The petals were there, intact, as if they had been placed minutes before. Only there was one problem. No one visited that grave, at least not during the day. At first I thought it was some long-time resident of the city who preferred to keep things quiet. Some people tend to abandon graves out of respect or superstition. But the more I observed, the more I realized something was wrong. First, there were no footprints around, not even faint marks in the earth. Second, the grave itself seemed disturbed. Not much, nothing blatant, but anyone who's worked in this field for years, like me, knows how to recognize when the earth isn't as it should be. It was on a particularly cold morning that the matter finally revealed itself. I was making my usual rounds, my flashlight cutting through the darkness between the rows of graves when I arrived at that grave. And for the first time I saw that the earth was visibly disturbed, as if someone had dug carefully so as not to attract attention. The top layer was loose, and the shape was odd, as if small hands had been moving it. That detail kept lingering in my mind for the rest of the night. It's easy to imagine explanations, animals, vandalism, even a previous maintenance error, but I knew none of them really fit. The pattern was too careful, and the flowers, they were still there, intact, atop the disturbed earth. I remember standing there for longer than I should have, trying to figure out if it was just a coincidence or if there was something I was missing. The cold cut through the air, but it wasn't just the cold that made my skin crawl. It was as if the very ground beneath my feet was alive. From that early morning on, something in me changed. I no longer saw that grave as part of the landscape. It was as if it had begun to occupy a space in my mind, always returning, always demanding attention. And even without knowing it, I was already involved in something I could no longer avoid. At that moment, I didn't yet know that what seemed like a strange phenomenon would turn into the most disturbing episode of all my years working in that cemetery. Because with each passing night, the grave became more insistent, and I was about to discover just how far it would go to be opened. I'd always considered the children's section of the cemetery the quietest place on the entire grounds. It wasn't just the usual early morning silence, but a different kind of stillness, almost heavy, as if the air there moved with more difficulty. The small headstones seemed to watch me with a kind of melancholy I couldn't explain. Even in the height of summer, that part of the grounds never seemed to fully warm up. It was my habit to pass by during my rounds, not because I had to. There was rarely any vandalism in that area, but because I felt a strange obligation to check that everything was in order. Maybe it was respect, maybe it was just routine. But after I noticed the movement at that particular grave, my attention was fixed on it, like a beacon in the night. The grave stood in a row near the east wall, partially shaded by an ancient tree with gnarled branches. It was a simple grave, a low white marble headstone, moss-covered at the edges, and a few hairline cracks. The engraved name was still legible: Emily Rose Whitford. Date of birth, 1964. Date of death, 1972. The space between these dates has always bothered me, perhaps because it forced me to think about the brevity of that child's life. Beside the name was a small sculpture of an angel, its hands clasped in prayer. The face was weathered, but still conveyed a gentle, almost sad expression. At the foot of the tombstone were the fresh flowers I saw so often. They were always the same type, white lilies. No matter the season, the color, or the weather, the lilies appeared as if freshly picked. Curious, I decided to look for more information about Emily. In the municipal archives, I found only a brief death record listing respiratory complications as the cause of death. There were no details about the funeral or family. The only additional information came from a yellowed newspaper clipping, which stated that shortly after the burial, the girl's parents moved out of state and were never seen in town again. There were no close relatives listed, and no one in the village seemed to recall seeing any visitors to the grave in all those years. However, among the cemetery's oldest employees, the story went differently. One of the older gardeners told me that, for decades, that grave was never without flowers. He said that even when a storm destroyed all the cemetery's arrangements, Emily's lilies remained intact, as if protected by an invisible hand. Others swore they'd seen a small figure in a white dress walking through the children's section on the coldest mornings, always disappearing behind the same gnarled tree. I confess that until then, I dismissed these stories as local folklore, the kind that thrives in places like Salem, where the past is marked by tragedy and superstition. But after seeing the disturbed earth with my own eyes, I began to reconsider. Something there wasn't simply being maintained, it was being cared for, and not by any of the living. I began to observe the grave more closely, trying to identify patterns. I discovered that the movement in the earth seemed to occur more in the days leading up to the anniversary of the girl's death, and, curiously, also during the week of her birthday. On these dates, the flowers seemed fresher than ever, and there was a faint scent in the air, perceptible even from a few meters away. The tree that shaded the grave also bothered me. Its thick roots seemed to stretch toward the grave, like fingers reaching for it. On windy nights, the branches creaked and shook strangely, and I had the feeling the sound was mingled with something else, like light footsteps on the grass. I also began to notice that whenever I got closer, the air changed. The temperature dropped a few degrees, and the wind that passed through the area seemed to have a different tone, like a hushed whisper coming from no particular direction. It was subtle, but impossible to ignore. One night, I decided to stay there longer, pretending to take maintenance notes while actually observing the grave. The moon was high and bright, illuminating the white marble like a lone candle in the darkness. That's when I noticed the flowers seemed slightly tilted, not by the wind, but as if they had been touched moments before. This detail made me wonder, if there were no visitors and no responsible animals, what was really moving there? And more importantly, why? The questions began to multiply, and with them, a strange anxiety. I dealt with desecrated graves, exhumations, and situations that would keep anyone awake at night. But this tomb affected me differently. It wasn't just the mystery, it was the constant feeling that there was an intention behind everything. An intention that sooner or later would be directed directly at me. And this intention began to manifest itself more clearly the first time I encountered the earth visibly disturbed. It was one early autumn dawn that Emily's grave went from being an oddity to an obsession. The air was humid, the wind carried the distant scent of rain, and a low-lying fog covered the ground like a blanket. I walked slowly through the children's ward, the flashlight's beam cutting through the white veil forming before me. When I reached her grave, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. The earth was disturbed, not like an irregular mound left by animals or the unevenness caused by erosion. No, it was disturbed carefully, as if small, patient hands had pushed the topsoil aside, preserving even the shape of the tombstone. The contour was too smooth to be accidental, The flowers remained there, lying on the earth intact, as if the someone who had disturbed it had taken care to put them back. My first impulse was to look around, looking for footprints, any sign that anyone had been there. But the fog made everything more difficult, and even when I bent down to examine closely, I found nothing. No bike tire tracks, no shoe prints, nothing. It was as if the earth itself had moved of its own accord. I thought about vandalism. I've seen teenagers try to pull pranks like that, but usually the results are sloppy. They trample the place, break flowers, leave wrappers or cans around. There was none of that here. The only violation was the slightly displaced earth and the strange perfection with which the flowers were positioned. The next morning I mentioned it to an older colleague, but he laughed and said he'd seen it happen many times. "It's her thing," he said, with the calmness of someone discussing the weather. He didn't elaborate. I didn't press the issue, at least not then, but the way he said it left me with a queasy feeling in my stomach. I decided to intervene. I returned to the grave with tools and compacted the earth, adjusting it so it was firm as it should be. I even added a thin layer of cement just below the surface, enough to prevent an animal from digging, but not so thick that it would appear to be a permanent barrier. I left, convinced that if there were to be any further disturbance, I would. No, it would not be the work of any creature. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, I returned at night to make my rounds, and upon reaching the row of children's headstones, I saw from afar that the surface was different. The flashlight revealed the same scene as before, disturbed earth, untouched flowers. But now something new chilled my blood. The small stone angel beside the headstone was tilted slightly forward, as if it had moved. I knelt and touched the base of the statue. The marble was ice cold, much colder than the rest of the surrounding stone, and for a moment it felt as if it vibrated almost imperceptibly beneath my fingers. It was instinctive to flinch. That same night, an even more disturbing detail occurred. As I walked away from the grave, I heard a sound behind me. It wasn't the wind, nor the creaking of the tree. It was a soft sound, like small fingers scratching the surface of the wood. I turned, but there was nothing. The silence that followed was so absolute that even my own breathing seemed too loud. I returned home that early morning with my mind full of questions and my heart racing. I dealt with strange things at the cemetery before, but this carried a different weight. There was care in the gestures, there was intention, and somehow that intention seemed oblivious to my noticing. From that moment on, I understood that I was dealing with something that didn't want to be ignored. And when things want to be seen, sooner or later, they find a way to show themselves. After that second time I found the dirt disturbed, I realized I needed proof. Something inside me already knew I wasn't dealing with vandalism or animals, but I needed to see it with my own eyes, or at least record it in a way that couldn't be disputed. That's how I decided to install cameras in the children's ward. I chose a discreet spot behind a low bush, with the perfect angle to capture Emily's entire grave. The camera had night vision and enough battery. Life to last for several days. Before leaving that night, I took one last look at the grave. The flowers were there, impeccable. The earth was firm. The stone angel, motionless. I spent 2 days avoiding looking at the photos. I don't know if it was fear of what I might find, or hope that nothing had happened, but on the third morning, when I arrived at the cemetery for my rounds, I noticed from a distance. The earth had, once again, been disturbed. This time, the flowers looked fresher than ever, almost as if they had been freshly picked. I rushed home at the end of my shift and connected the camera to my computer. The first few hours of recording showed only the slow swaying of the trees and the passing of clouds beneath the moon. But then, around 3 in the morning, something changed. A dim spot of light appeared in the corner of the frame, as if it were a reflection, but there was nothing there to reflect it. Gradually, The light moved toward the grave until it disappeared. Right above it, for the next few minutes, nothing visible happened. No figures, no defined shadows, only one almost imperceptible detail. The flowers, which had previously been slightly tilted to the side, began to straighten on their own. It was subtle, but when I fast-forwarded the video, I saw clearly that the movement wasn't caused by the wind. It was as if invisible hands were carefully adjusting them. I continued watching, my heart racing, until I noticed something even more disturbing. At one point, the shadow of the tree beside the grave lengthened in a way that didn't correspond to the direction of the moonlight. It was as if someone were standing behind the headstone, casting a hazy silhouette. The shape remained there for a few seconds before disappearing, and the next instant, the earth began to shift, sinking slightly in one spot, as if it were being excavated from within. The video showed nothing else until dawn, but even with this scant evidence, I knew it was no coincidence. Something was manifesting in that grave, and the most disturbing thing was the gentleness with which it did so, as if there were an almost maternal care. The following nights confirmed that the presence had no intention of hiding from me. Whenever I passed the children's ward, the air changed. The wind grew cooler, and a soft scent of fresh lilies appeared out of nowhere, even when there were no new flowers. The sound changed too. It was as if the silence grew thicker, drowning out even the distant sounds of the city. One particular morning, as I was closing the east gate, I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned and saw, at the edge of the mist covering the ground, the small angel sculpture beside the tombstone. Only it wasn't in its usual position. Its body was slightly tilted, and its face, though weathered with age, seemed turned directly toward me. I approached slowly, the lantern trembling in my hand. I touched the angel, and the stone was cold, almost painful, to the touch. It was then that I heard for the first time a sound coming clearly from the direction of the grave. It wasn't the wind, nor the rustling of leaves. It was a low, repetitive sound, like fingernails scratching wood. I took a step back, but I couldn't take my eyes off that spot. I felt with a strange certainty that Emily was aware of my presence, and somehow she wanted me to know she was there too. Little did I know that this connection would become much more intense when I started seeing her, but not at the cemetery. The first time I dreamed about her, I woke up in a cold sweat, my breath shallow and my heart racing. In the dream, I was in the cemetery itself, but something was different. The moon seemed larger, the light more intense, and the silence. The silence wasn't the same as I knew it. It was as if all the sounds of the world had been removed, leaving only that muffled weight pressing down on my ears. I stood before Emily's grave. The flowers were fresh, but they weren't lilies. They were white roses, and each petal looked so real that I could smell the sweet scent mixed with the heavy aroma of wet earth. Then I saw it. A girl, no older than 8, standing on the other side of the headstone. She wore a white dress, her feet bare, her straight hair falling over her face. She looked at me with an expression that was neither joy nor sadness. It was anticipation. When she spoke, it wasn't with her mouth. Her voice simply came to me, clear as if she were right next to me. "Open the door." I didn't understand right away, but the way she said it made my stomach churn. I tried to respond, but my words seemed to vanish into thin air before they reached her. The girl took a step back, slowly disappearing into the mist gathering behind the tree. It was at that moment that I woke up, sitting up in bed, my hands freezing, my body trembling. I tried to convince myself it was just a reflection of what I'd seen in the cemetery, a figment of my own imagination. But the second dream dispelled any doubt that something more was going on. This time it was dark, and I walked down a narrow hallway, the uneven ground beneath my feet. The smell of earth was intense, almost suffocating. Up ahead, an ancient wooden door, locked with a thin chain. The girl appeared beside me without the sound of footsteps and repeated, "Open the door." When I looked at her, I noticed a detail that chilled me. On the sleeve of her dress was a small brown stain, like old blood. Her eyes, once dark, now reflected a pale light, and there was something in them that seemed to recognize something in me. Before I could ask, she leaned closer and whispered my mother's name. I woke with such a jolt, I nearly fell out of bed. I ran my hands over my face, trying to understand how this child could know something so personal. I hadn't spoken about my family to anyone at the cemetery, and yet the feeling I was left with was that she not only knew, she had always known. From then on, the dreams became frequent. Their details always varied, but her presence was constant. Sometimes she was more distant, observing in silence. Other times she would come so close that I could feel her cold breath when she spoke. Her request was always the same: open the door, but with each repetition the intonation changed. At first, it sounded like a calm request. Then it became more urgent, almost an order. I started waking up in the middle of the night to the smell of wet earth, permeating the room, even with the windows closed. Some mornings, I noticed small grains of dirt on the sheets, as if they had fallen from somewhere just above me. I began sleeping poorly, avoiding going to bed early, afraid of encountering it again. But it was no use. The feeling that Emily was following me out of the cemetery grew stronger and stronger. One night I woke up and saw, in the corner of my room, the silhouette of a motionless child. I couldn't make out her face, but her white dress was there, illuminated by the dim light coming from the street. I blinked and she was gone. It was at that point that I realized whatever was happening had already transcended any physical boundaries. She was no longer trapped in that tomb. And if she was coming to me in her dreams, it was because she wanted something, and she was willing to wait as long as it took for me to give in. And the final proof that this wasn't a figment of my imagination came when I found in an old record a detail that linked Emily directly to my own family. I knew that if I wanted answers, I'd have to go back to the municipal records and dig deeper. The dreams were becoming more vivid, and my mother's name, repeated by that childish voice, couldn't be a coincidence. I spent the entire morning leafing through old files, yellowed newspapers, and cemetery records. It was in a 1972 notebook, handwritten by the former administrator, that I found the first real clue. On the day of Emily's funeral, there was an extra note. Service held in the presence of Mrs. Margaret Whitford and a guest, Anna Miller. My heart froze. Anna Miller was my mother's name. I kept reading. The record said the two had been together throughout the ceremony and that Anna had seemed emotionally shaken, as if she knew the girl well. But my mother had never mentioned this. She had never spoken of knowing Emily or any connection to the Whitfords. The most disturbing part came at the end of the entry. After the burial, Mrs. Miller remained beside the casket for more than 10 minutes, speaking softly, something that was incomprehensible. When she left a small object inside the urn of flowers. I didn't know what to think. My mother's presence at that funeral, years before I was born, and the fact that she had left something there, completely changed everything. It was no longer just an inexplicable phenomenon. It was something personal. I returned home, my head racing, trying to decide whether to confront my mother about it. But before I could, that very night I dreamed of Emily again. She was closer than ever, her face now fully visible. She didn't smile, she didn't blink, she just repeated in a low but authoritative tone, "Open the door." I woke up certain she wasn't asking to open her grave out of mere curiosity. She was asking to open something my mother had sealed away, something that until that moment I had no idea what it could be. And it was this certainty that led me the following night, in a storm, back to the cemetery. The rain was falling heavily when I walked through the cemetery gates that night. The cold wind carried the rustling of leaves and the crackling of branches, but nothing could drown out the feeling that I was being watched. I walked straight to Emily's grave, my flashlight illuminating the soaked marble and the flowers, which this time looked freshly picked, even in the storm. With trembling hands, I began to remove the earth, each shovel revealing the dull sound of rain hitting the mud. Within minutes, I found something solid, a small, dark wooden box, swollen with moisture. I lifted it and felt something light but moving inside. Before I could open it, I heard breathing behind me. Slow, deep, childlike. I turned slowly, and there she was, Emily. Her white dress was clinging to her body from the rain, her hair plastered to her face, and her gaze pierced any defenses I might have had. She took a step forward and whispered so close I felt the coldness of the words. Now you know, but she's not the only one. And that's when I realized that this wouldn't be the last grave to open itself.